Sarah Martinez never imagined that her childhood dream of becoming a doctor would lead her to the most dangerous battlefields in the world. Growing up in a small Texas town, she spent countless hours watching medical shows and reading about surgeons who saved lives under pressure. Her father, a retired Army sergeant, always told her that the best doctors were those who could work miracles when everything was falling apart around them. After graduating from medical school, Sarah felt something was missing. The sterile hospital environments and routine procedures didn't satisfy her need for purpose. She wanted to save lives where it mattered most, where her skills could make the difference between a soldier coming home or never seeing their family again. That's when she learned about the Navy SEALs medical program. The training was brutal beyond anything she had experienced. While other recruits struggled with the physical demands, Sarah found herself pushing through barriers she never knew existed. Her instructors were skeptical at first. A petite woman from Texas trying to become a SEAL medic seemed unlikely to succeed. But Sarah had something that couldn't be taught, an unbreakable determination to prove that healing hands could be just as strong as fighting ones. During Hell Week, when most candidates were dropping out from exhaustion, Sarah carried a teammate who had collapsed during a night exercise. She performed emergency first aid while other trainees held security, all while hypothermia set in from the cold ocean water. Her commanding officer later said it was the moment he knew she belonged with the teams. The advanced medical training that followed was where Sarah truly excelled. She learned to perform surgery in complete darkness, treat gunshot wounds while under enemy fire, and make life-or-death decisions in seconds. Her instructors taught her that being a SEAL medic meant being ready to run toward danger when everyone else was running away. After 2 years of intensive training, Sarah received her first deployment assignment. She was heading to Afghanistan as part of an elite special operations team. The night before she left, her father called her. His voice was proud but worried as he reminded her of something he had told her as a child. Courage isn't about not being afraid, Sarah. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified. As her transport plane lifted off American soil, Sarah looked out at the lights of home disappearing below. She carried with her not just medical supplies and weapons, but the hopes of every family whose loved one she might have to save. She had no idea that in just a few weeks, she would face a moment that would test everything she had learned and change her understanding of what it truly meant to be a warrior. The dusty mountains of Afghanistan were nothing like the training facilities back home. Sarah's team had been operating in the region for 3 weeks, conducting reconnaissance missions and gathering intelligence on enemy movements. The heat was overwhelming during the day, and the cold at night cut through even the best military gear. But what struck Sarah most was the silence between missions, a heavy quiet that made every small sound seem like a potential threat. Her team consisted of 8 highly trained operators, each with their own specialty. There was Marcus, the team leader who had been deployed 6 times and could read the landscape like a book. Jake handled communications and could call in air support faster than anyone Sarah had ever seen. Tommy was the explosives expert who joked constantly to keep morale up, even in the most dangerous situations. The local village they were protecting had become like a second home to the team. The children would wave at them from behind mud brick walls, and the elderly men would nod respectfully when they passed. Sarah had learned a few words in the local language and often helped treat minor injuries for the villagers. It reminded her why she had chosen this path, to help people who had nowhere else to turn. On the morning that would change everything, Sarah was checking her medical supplies when Marcus received an urgent radio call. Intelligence had located a high-value target in a compound about 10 miles from their position. The mission was supposed to be a quick in-and-out operation, capture or eliminate the target and extract before enemy reinforcements could arrive. As they loaded into their vehicles, Sarah felt the familiar mix of adrenaline and focus that came before every mission. She reviewed her medical protocols and checked that her trauma kit was easily accessible. The other team members went through their own pre-mission rituals. Some prayed quietly. Others checked their weapons for the 100th time. The landscape rolled by in dusty waves as they drove toward the target location. Sarah watched the horizon, noting potential landing zones for medical evacuation helicopters and identifying buildings that could provide cover if things went wrong. Her training had taught her to always think 3 steps ahead, to be ready for the moment when split-second decisions would determine who lived and who died. When they reached the compound, everything seemed routine at first. The building was isolated, surrounded by rocky terrain that provided good overwatch positions. Marcus positioned the team strategically, with Sarah staying close enough to reach anyone who might need immediate medical attention, but far enough back to avoid the initial assault. As the team prepared to breach the compound, Sarah performed one final check of her equipment. She had no idea that within the next hour, she would face an enemy unlike any she had trained for, and that her medical skills would be tested in ways that no classroom or simulation could have prepared her for. The explosion came without warning. Sarah was monitoring the radio when the ground beneath her feet shook violently, and a massive fireball erupted from the compound's main building. The blast was so powerful that it shattered windows in buildings half a mile away and sent debris flying in all directions. What was supposed to be a controlled breach had turned into chaos in seconds. Through her headset, Sarah heard Marcus shouting commands, but his voice was strained with pain. Jake's communication equipment had been damaged in the explosion, cutting off their connection to headquarters. The team was effectively alone, surrounded by enemy fire that seemed to come from every direction. Sarah grabbed her medical kit and sprinted toward the sound of gunfire. She found Marcus first, pinned behind a concrete barrier with shrapnel wounds in his left leg and arm. Blood was soaking through his uniform, but he was still trying to coordinate the team's response. "How bad?" Sarah asked as she quickly assessed his injuries. "I'll live," Marcus replied through gritted teeth. "But Tommy's in trouble." He was closest to the building when it went up. Making her way to Tommy's position required crossing 30 yards of open ground, while bullets whizzed overhead. Sarah had practiced this scenario dozens of times in training, but the reality was far more terrifying. She moved in short bursts, using whatever cover she could find, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. When she reached Tommy, Sarah's medical training immediately took over, pushing aside the fear and adrenaline. He was unconscious, bleeding from multiple wounds, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. Shrapnel had penetrated his body armor, and he was losing blood fast. Sarah knew she had maybe 10 minutes to stabilize him before shock would make survival impossible. Working under fire, Sarah started an IV line and began treating Tommy's most critical wounds. Her hands moved with practiced precision even as explosions echoed around them. She had to make dozens of split-second decisions: which wound to treat first, how much medication to administer, whether to risk moving him to better cover. Jake crawled over to provide security while Sarah worked. "How's he looking?" he asked, reloading his rifle. Sarah didn't want to lie, but she also didn't want to destroy the team's morale. "He's fighting," she said simply, which was the truth. Tommy was fighting for every breath, and Sarah was fighting just as hard to keep him alive. The enemy fire was intensifying, and Sarah realized they were in a coordinated ambush. This wasn't just bad luck. Someone had known they were coming. As she continued working on Tommy, she heard a new sound that made her blood run cold: the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. The real battle was just beginning, and she was about to face the greatest test of her career as both a medic and a warrior. The mortar rounds began falling like deadly rain around their position. Sarah threw herself over Tommy's body to protect him from the flying debris, feeling the ground shake with each explosion. Dirt and rocks pelted her back as she tried to maintain pressure on his wounds. In the chaos, she heard Jake screaming into his radio, desperately trying to reach anyone who could send help. Between the explosions, Sarah heard something that made her heart sink: the sound of approaching vehicles. Through the dust and smoke, she could see at least 6 trucks filled with armed fighters heading straight for their position. The team was outnumbered 3-1, running low on ammunition, and had 2 critically wounded members who couldn't be moved. Marcus, despite his own injuries, was still trying to coordinate their defense. He had positioned the remaining team members in a defensive circle, but Sarah could see in his eyes that he was calculating odds that didn't look good. "We need to move Tommy," he told Sarah during a brief lull in the firing. "This position won't hold much longer." Sarah looked at her patient and made a decision that went against every medical protocol she had learned. Tommy was barely stable, and moving him would likely restart the internal bleeding she had managed to control, but staying meant certain death for all of them. "Give me 2 minutes," she told Marcus, then began preparing Tommy for transport in a way she had never attempted in real combat. Using techniques she had only practiced in simulations, Sarah created a field stretcher from broken wood and torn fabric. She administered a risky dose of stimulants to keep Tommy's blood pressure stable during movement. knowing that too much could kill him but too little would mean he wouldn't survive the journey to safety. As the enemy vehicles drew closer, Sarah made another split-second medical decision. She spotted a young Afghan girl, maybe 14 years old, hiding behind a damaged wall about 50 meters away. The girl was bleeding from a head wound and looked terrified. Sarah's training told her to focus on her team, but her conscience wouldn't let her abandon a wounded child. "Cover me," she shouted to Jake, then sprinted toward the girl while carrying her medical kit. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet as she ran, but Sarah's focus was entirely on reaching the wounded child. When she slid into cover next to the girl, Sarah quickly assessed her injuries. The head wound looked worse than it was, but the girl was in shock and couldn't understand what Sarah was trying to tell her. Using the few words of local language she knew, combined with gentle hand gestures, Sarah managed to calm the girl enough to treat her wound. As she worked, the girl stared at Sarah with wide, frightened eyes. Sarah realized that this might be the first time the girl had seen an American soldier up close, and certainly the first time she had been helped by one. The moment that would define Sarah's entire military career came when the girl, despite her fear and confusion, grabbed Sarah's hand and asked a single question in broken English. "You soldier girl? You fight too?" The question hit Sarah harder than any explosion or gunfire. Here was a child, caught in the middle of a war she didn't understand, trying to comprehend how someone could be both a healer and a warrior. Looking into the girl's frightened but curious eyes, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The question, "You fight too?" echoed in her mind as explosions continued around them. In that moment, Sarah realized that everything she had trained for had led to this single instant, not just saving lives, but showing this child that strength and compassion could exist in the same person. "Yes," Sarah said softly in the girl's language, the word coming out more clearly than she expected. "I fight for you." The girl's grip on her hand tightened, and Sarah saw a flicker of hope replace some of the fear in her eyes. It was then that Sarah understood her true mission wasn't just about completing operations or following orders. It was about proving that even in the darkest moments, someone would risk everything to protect the innocent. The enemy fighters were now close enough that Sarah could hear their voices. She had to get the girl to safety and return to her team. But Tommy was still critical, and Marcus was barely holding the perimeter. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She would do both, even if it meant putting her own life at maximum risk. Using hand signals, Sarah directed the girl toward a safer position behind a concrete wall. Then she began the most dangerous sprint of her life, carrying medical supplies back to Tommy while enemy fighters closed in from 3 directions. Bullets cracked past her ears, and she felt the heat of tracer rounds passing inches from her body. When she reached Tommy, Sarah found that his condition had worsened during her absence. His pulse was weak and irregular, and his breathing had become labored. She had minutes, maybe less, to stabilize him again before his injuries would become fatal. Working faster than she ever had before, Sarah managed to restart his IV and administer emergency medication, while Jake and the other team members held off the advancing enemy. Marcus crawled over to Sarah's position, blood still seeping from his leg wound. "Extraction is 15 minutes out," he said, his voice strained but determined. "Can Tommy make it?" Sarah looked at her patient, then at the approaching enemy forces, then back at Marcus. 15 minutes might as well have been 15 hours given their situation. "Not here," Sarah replied honestly. "We need to move him to that ridgeline for pickup, but the movement will probably kill him." Marcus understood immediately. They were facing an impossible choice between certain death from enemy fire and probable death from medical complications. It was then that Sarah remembered something her father had told her years ago about impossible situations. Sometimes the only way through is to rewrite the rules entirely. Looking at the tactical situation, Sarah realized there was one option no one had considered, an option that would require her to trust her medical skills more than she ever had before, and to take a risk that could save everyone or cost them all their lives. Sarah began preparing for a procedure she had only read about in medical journals, something that had never been attempted in active combat conditions. As she worked, she explained her plan to Marcus, whose expression shifted from skepticism to amazement to grim determination as he realized what she was proposing to do. Sarah's plan was radical and dangerous. She would perform an emergency field surgery to temporarily seal Tommy's internal bleeding, allowing him to survive the movement to the extraction point. The procedure had never been attempted under combat conditions, and failure would mean certain death. But Sarah had calculated that without trying, Tommy had zero chance of survival anyway. Working with hands steadied by pure determination, Sarah began the delicate procedure while Jake and the remaining team members formed a protective barrier around her. Enemy fighters were now within 100 meters, and she could hear their commanders shouting orders in the distance. Every few seconds she had to pause as bullets impacted near her position, but she forced herself to continue. The young Afghan girl, despite Sarah's instructions to stay hidden, had crawled closer to watch. Sarah realized the girl was fascinated not by the violence around them, but by seeing a woman taking charge in a situation where everyone else seemed helpless. The girl's presence gave Sarah an unexpected source of strength. She was not just saving Tommy, but showing this child what was possible. After what felt like hours but was actually 12 minutes, Sarah completed the procedure. Tommy's vital signs immediately began to improve and his breathing became more stable. "He'll make it to the helicopter," Sarah told Marcus with confidence she didn't entirely feel. The next challenge was moving him across 200 meters of open ground, while under heavy enemy fire. The extraction began like a perfectly choreographed dance. Marcus and Jake provided covering fire, while Sarah and 2 other team members carried Tommy on the makeshift stretcher. The Afghan girl followed close behind Sarah, having refused to be left alone. Enemy bullets whistled around them, and twice they had to drop to the ground as mortar rounds exploded nearby. Halfway to the landing zone, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of approaching helicopters. The extraction team was coming in early, having heard the intensity of the firefight over the radio. As the helicopters appeared over the ridgeline, their door gunners began laying down suppressing fire that forced the enemy fighters to take cover. In the final sprint to the landing zone, Sarah felt everything that had brought her to this moment. Her childhood dreams of saving lives, her father's lessons about courage, her brutal training, and her determination to prove that healing and fighting could coexist in the same person. The helicopters touched down in a whirlwind of dust and rotor wash. As they loaded Tommy into the medical helicopter, he briefly regained consciousness. His eyes found Sarah's face and he managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Doc," he whispered before the flight medics took over his care. Sarah knew then that her field surgery had worked. Tommy would live to see his family again. The young Afghan girl stood at the edge of the landing zone as the helicopters prepared to leave. Sarah knelt down beside her and pressed a small medical kit into her hands, basic supplies that could help her family. "You can heal too," Sarah said in the girl's language, the words coming more naturally now. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah looked back to see the girl standing tall despite everything she had witnessed, holding the medical kit like a treasure. In that moment, Sarah understood that the most important battle she had fought wasn't against the enemy fighters, but against the idea that strength and compassion couldn't exist together. Years later, Sarah would receive a letter written in careful English from a young woman studying to become a doctor in Afghanistan. The letter began, "Dear soldier girl, you showed me that healing hands can also be brave hands. Thank you for teaching me that we can fight for life instead of fighting for death." Sarah kept that letter with her through 3 more deployments, a reminder of the day she learned that the greatest victory wasn't surviving the battle, but inspiring someone else to choose hope over fear.